Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of 12 Months of Black Pride, a DC Black Pride presentation program of the Center for Black Equity. My name is Kenya Hutton, and I serve as a deputy director for DC Black. For the Center for Black Equity, based here in Washington D.C. As you all know, due to the current pandemic, we had to make a couple of changes with how Pride looks this year. So in February, we launched 12 Months of Pride. What that is going to be is everything that we normally do during Pride weekend, we're going to do it all year long. So from Black History Month, February that just passed, all the way to February next year, we'll be announcing the 2022 theme. So that's the thing. So every month we're going to have a different activity. In the month of May, we're going to have a lot of activities just because, here in DC, Mayor Bowser last year made a proclamation that May is DC Black Pride Month. So we want to keep that alive. And our first conversation we're going to have today is a history of Black gay DC. It's a title calling Influence of a Nation. And without further ado, what I'm going to do is I want to bring up our speaker for tonight, Mr. Christopher Prince.
Hey, Kenya.
Hey, how are you?
I am excellent. How are you doing?
I'm pretty good. Thanks for joining us this evening.
Yeah.
So if you want to tell the folks a little bit about yourself before we start.
Well, I have been on the scene here for quite some time. I am a poet, singer, activist, actor, multi-dimension kind of person. I am presently working on a documentary entitled Fierceness Served, which is part of my presentation. You hear about that a little later on. I have a gig coming up in the beginning of April 2nd, as part of the
Awesome.
On Air Festival. Again, another transition due to COVID. The Atlas Theater usually has an Intersections Festival, which is like a 3-week festival. And since people cannot gather on person, they're doing it virtually. So I'm lucky enough to be performing online on Friday, the 2nd at 8 o'clock at atlas.org. It's a free presentation. I've been involved in the Black gay political scene and creative scene here in DC since the 80s. And that is what I'm going to be talking to you guys about this evening.
Awesome. Thank you. Make sure you send us a link. We'll definitely share it on our platform so we can get as much people to watch you as possible. All right. So I'm going to hop off the screen and hand everything over to you. All right. Talk to you soon.
Thank you. Greetings, everybody. Kenya is going to be running the slides here, so you're going to hear me go next and pause, and that's just going to be me queuing him up. This presentation is entitled Influencing a National Identity. Next. My name is Christopher Prince, a third-generation Washingtonian. Next. My family's DC history begins during the Great Migration. That is the movement of 6 million African Americans, next, from the South to the urban Northeast. Next slide. The Great Migration is a movement of folks going from the South to the Northeast, Midwest, and Western parts of the U.S. Next slide. During the 1916 to 1970. Next slide. My maternal grandfather moved from the South Carolina to be exact, to DC in 1916. My paternal grandfather moved here from the same state in the 40s. Next slide. I came out in DC and am blessed to have been part of its vibrant Black gay history. This DC history has had a major influence on creating a national Black gay cultural and political identity. Next slide. During the 1980s, DC experienced a Black gay renaissance, which is where I would like to focus. However, this groundswell of Black culture and political activity did not erupt in isolation. Next slide. So any discussion of DC's Black gay community cannot be separated from the history of the city. So I'm going to go back a little bit and show you a little bit of history and then come up to the 80s with some context. Next slide. The McCarthy era which is 1950 to 1954, was a difficult period for homosexuals in Washington, D.C. In the book, The Age of Anxiety, McCarthyism to Terrorism, Haynes Johnson states that the senator and his chief counsel, Roy Cohn, took it as their mission to search for every homosexual in the federal government. And yes, that's the same Roy Cohn that was a running buddy of our former occupant of the White House's father. So at least you know where that seed of craziness came from, right? This compounded an already oppressive environment in a city where, in spite of the 1953 Supreme Court order, next slide, to end segregation in restaurants, the African Americans were unwelcome in the white gay scene. Nonetheless, African American lesbians and gays created spaces of their own, next slide, during this era, with gatherings that echoed the eras of the private house parties in the 1940s. Next slide. In 1957, the African American population of DC surpassed 50%, making it the first city in modern U.S. history to have a majority Black population. Next slide. DC's Black gay social clubs began developing in the late 60s. These included, next slide, the Group, the Best of Washington, the Associates, and the Metropolitan Capitalites. What a name. Next slide. The Associates, founded in 1971, was a group of Black gay men that included lawyers, doctors, and professors. Next slide. The Best of Washington, also formed in the early 70s, it also included women and transgender individuals as part of their membership. Now, one thing, these clubs marked a distinct class separation, something that we as Black people are uncomfortable talking about. And in the Black gay community, we rarely discuss, but it was a reality because most of the members in these social clubs were middle class professionals. Next slide. In 1971, Black folks were 71% of the population in Washington, D.C., earning the city the nickname of Chocolate City. Next slide. A moniker immortalized in the title of the third album by the funk band Parliament, which is a big deal for all of us nation Washingtonians. And this little shout out for all you funketeers. You know who you are, but I digress. Next slide. In 1970, as mainstream gay clubs began to open around D.C., our Black gay citizens faced racism and discrimination. Next slide. The policy of carding, which is the policy of requiring multiple forms of ID for admission to clubs, was a tactic that several white gay nightclub owners used to prevent African Americans from patronizing their clubs. Two of the most popular clubs at the time, the Grand Central, next slide, and the Lost and Found, were notorious for carding. And I personally can tell you of many a situation of going to the Lost and Found and having to sit and be held up outside trying to prove that I was of age or jump through many hoops just to get into the club. The National Coalition of Black Gays and members of DC's white and Black men together helped document this discrimination by sending test cases to the clubs. And what they would do was, let's say at 11:45, Robert and Seymour, a white couple, would go to the Lost and Found. They would record what time they went there, record what kind of ID they had to show to get in, or whether they had to show any ID at all. And then at 11:47, Bob and John, a Black couple, would go to the bar, to the Lost and Found, and they would record what their experiences were trying to get in. And this documentation helped to build up the case against for discrimination against these clubs. Next slide. 7 people filed a racial discrimination complaint against the Grand Central and were awarded $5,500 in damages and legal fees. Now, one of the sources that I researched stated that rather than pay that $5,500, the Grand Central closed its doors in 1977. So I'll let you know what was going on. Now, there were, however, other venues that catered to DC's black gay population. Next slide. There was the Nob Hill Restaurant, which is at 1101 Kenyon Street, Northwest. It began as an upscale private club in 1953 for gay and bisexual black men in the Columbia Heights era, which is a section in Northwest Washington, D.C. By the time the Nob Hill closed in 2004, it was the oldest operating black gay bar in the country and the only black-owned gay bar on the East Coast. This is a real element of distinction because we all go out, we all have a good time all over the country, but there are very few of our clubs that we own. I could think of the Catch that was in San Francisco that had, I think it's since closed, but that was open for a long time. But on the whole East Coast, from New York going all the way down, the only place black owned in the East Coast was this club right here, the Nob Hill. Next slide, please. There was also the Third World, which was located on Riggs Road in Northeast DC. The social club that I mentioned earlier, the Metropolitan Capitolites, expanded to the Third World when their house parties grew too large for their homes. In 1975, several years into this period of racial discrimination in the mainstream gay clubs, next slide, please, the clubhouse opened in Northwest Washington, D.C. as a private membership-based nightclub. Its focus was centered on the social lives of black, gays, and lesbians. Next slide. It was a non-alcoholic beverage environment that opened at 11:30 p.m. and closed at 5 o'clock in the morning. And believe it or not, some kids would go up in there and party all night, leave the clubhouse, and then march on to church. Next slide, please. The greatest clubhouse legacy was the Children's Hour. This was an annual event held during the Memorial Day weekend. People would travel as far as Richmond, Virginia, and going far north as New York City to attend the Children's Hour. Like the social clubs that preceded the clubhouse, they held philanthropic events there, especially during the AIDS epidemic. Next slide. The AIDS epidemic devastated Washington's gay population. On September 28th, next slide, 1983, the Women Walker Clinic and the DC Coalition of Black Gays sponsored a forum that focused on AIDS for the Black and Third World gays at the clubhouse. Now, during the 70s, I would say the late 70s, up throughout the 80s, it was a profound time of activism in DC. During this period, there was a black gay renaissance that developed in Washington. Next slide. As Jenny Beeman stated in her book, A Queer Capital, an unprecedented public presence through the creation of political organizations, cultural spaces, next slide, a predominantly black gay evangelical church, and ultimately their own pride was established in Washington, D.C. Next slide. Much of this activity was in response to the AIDS epidemic. Racism also served as a catalyst for this resurgence of black gay political organizing. Many LGBTQ African Americans at this time felt that their needs were not being recognized by most of the LGBTQ mainstream organizations. Next slide. In 1978, A. Billy Jones Hennon of Washington, D.C., along with Lewis Hughes, a black gay male activist from Baltimore, formed the D.C. and Baltimore Coalition of Black Gays. This was the country's first long-standing black LGBTQ political organization. The DC Coalition did not form in reaction to mainstream gay activism, but to specifically address the needs of the black gay community. This is a sentiment that propelled itself throughout the 80s when it came to not only the political organizing, but the artistic expression of black gays and lesbians in DC during that time. We were working on what our community needed and had come to realize that we were our best narrative, the best voice, the best hand for assistance for our community. Next slide. Black gay activists from other countries started to make contact with the members of the DC coalition for help in organizing chapters in their own cities. Eventually, the National Coalition of Black Gays was officially formed. Next slide. In addition to chapters in Washington and Baltimore, there were chapters in Atlanta, Chicago, Detroit, Minneapolis, New York City, Philadelphia, and other cities. For the first time in the United States, Black gays and lesbians had access to a national organization that defined their racial and sexual identities. Next slide. All this began in Washington, D.C. Next slide, please. The National Coalition of Black Gays and Lesbians hosted the Third World Lesbian Gay Conference in 1979. This was the first kind of event to ever happen. The event took place in conjunction with the 1979, next slide please, National March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights. And this spurred more political activity for Black LGBTQ people around the country to organize. Gay Black folk from all over the United States, Mexico, Canada, and the Caribbean participated in that Third World Gay Lesbian Conference. This was a big deal because this was the first time that people of African descent internationally came together to start to discuss their political and cultural empowerment. Next slide. The creation of Howard University's Lambda Student Alliance, which is the first openly gay organization on an HBCU campus, is an example of that event's influence. And that is because there were several Howard students that came to that Third World Conference that became empowered and politicized and took their political energy back to the campus of Howard University. In 1991, Wilmore Cook, Theodore Kirkland, and Ernest Hopkins saw a need to rally the community around the HIV and AIDS epidemic in Washington, D.C. Next slide. Little did they know that their dream of clearly communicating the impact and educating the community on HIV and AIDS would lead to a movement that would impact the lives of millions of Black LGBTQ women and men around the country. Next slide, please. And that was DC Black Pride. Next slide. The foundation of DC Pride was the crowd that came to DC for the Children's Hour. And all this kind of compounded itself. The Children's Hour kind of helped everything to kind of flourish. The reason why there were people that asked the DC Coalition of Black Gays and Lesbians about organizing was that when they came to DC from wherever they came in, by this time, people were coming from as far as California to come to the Children's Hour. There would be tables set up at the clubhouse. There would be other events around the city that weekend. And people started seeing that the DC gay folk were organizing. They were like, wow, this is great. Can we do this too? So it all kind of happened. And this wouldn't have had a foundation to grow from if it wasn't for the Children's Hour. The first DC Black Pride drew 800 people to Banneker Field on a day themed Let's Come Together. Next slide. It was a festive amalgamation of all of the Black gay artists, political organizations, activists, social clubs, health clubs, and bars. DC Black Gay Pride was the catalyst for what is now referred to as the Black Pride movement. Next slide. Since the birth of DC Pride, more than 36 other Pride celebrations now take place throughout the world, many of them using the DC Pride as a model. Next slide. This groundswell of activity that happened in the 80s also included magazines, newsletters, and journals. There was the Blacklight Magazine, which was founded in 1979 by Sidney Brinkley. Next slide. Sidney was a student at Howard University and also a member of Howard University's Lambda Student Alliance. Sidney's publication fulfilled the need for self-respect and self-expression among Black gays in print, with a wide circulation in D.C., nationally, and even internationally. There were also some smaller magazines that were out, like Mailbox, spelled M-A-L-E box, and Female, spelled F-E-M-I-M-A-I-L. So we were being real witty. Next slide. Blackout was a quarterly magazine first published by the National Coalition of Black Gays and Lesbians in 1986. With Philadelphia's Joseph Beam as its editor, the magazine considered itself to be the voice of a new movement of Black lesbians and gays, and a revolutionary publication in the face of discrimination. Next slide. Speaking about that era around the 80s, I'm proud to be the project director for an upcoming documentary entitled Fierceness Served, the Enoch Alley Coffee House. Next slide. The coffee house was at the epicenter of this Black gay renaissance. Named for the streets that bordered its location, E for 8th Street, N for 9th Street, I and K for those streets respectively, the coffee house was a renovated carriage house, next slide, that sat in an alley in Northeast Washington. The founder of the coffee house, next slide, was Ray Melrose. This venue served as a meeting space for the DC Coalition of Black Gays and Lesbians when they first started organizing. It was also the meeting space for a Black lesbian support group called Sapphire Sapphos. The coffee house also served as a rehearsal space, next slide, for a group of poets, musicians, actors, and visual artists who had previously been meeting and performing in private homes. They, unbeknownst to themselves at the time, were recreating a salon scene that followed the traditions of the Harlem Renaissance poet, next slide, Georgia Douglas Johnson, whose house at 1461 South Street Northwest would in 1929 become known as the S Street Salon. And this lets you know just the historic trajectory of what's been happening in DC and the rich Black history and Black gay history that was going on in the city. Next slide, please. Thurlow Evans Tibbs often hosted these coffee house artists at the Evans Tibbs Gallery, which was his home and was the home of his grandmother, next slide, opera singer Lillian Ivanti. Madame Ivanti, like her contemporary Miss Johnson, regularly hosted their friends Langston Hughes, next slide, Zora Neale Hurston, Bruce Nugent, next slide, Alain Locke, as DC's contribution to the Harlem Renaissance. Now, this connection is rarely discussed, but people like Madame Avanti, who was internationally known at the time, Georgia Douglas Johnson, Sterling Brown, were all very active in the Harlem Renaissance. And even though that Harlem tag was on there, they lived here in D.C. and would travel up to New York a lot. And people like Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes and W.E.B. Du Bois, they would come down to D.C. and hang out. So the salon scene that happened to New York was also happening in D.C., but just nobody really talks about that D.C. side of that equation. In that coffee house cohort of artists and political people were, and you can go to the next slide, please, seminal writer and performer Essex Hemphill, whose work in 1986 was included in the groundbreaking anthology of Black gay writing edited by the National Coalition member Joseph Beam, called In the Life. In 1989, Hemphill's poems were featured in the award-winning documentaries Tongues Untied, next slide, and in Looking for Langston, which was done by Isaac Julian in London. Through Essex, this started to begin an international connection to what was happening in Washington through these films. Next slide. Photographer Sharon Farmer was also part of the coffee house cohort. Sharon was the first African-American woman to be hired as a White House photographer and the first African-American and woman to be the director of the White House Photography Office. And this was during the Clinton administration. Next slide. Award-winning filmmaker Michelle Parkerson is also part of that cohort. Her work has been shown widely in festivals and on public television. They include the documentary A Litany for Survival, the work of and life of Audre Lorde, and Got to Make This Journey, a film about Sweet Honey in the Rock. Next slide. The documentary will also highlight the work of other coffeehouse artists with archival footage, audio clips, articles, and reviews. The focus will include many other talented individuals that people might not have heard of, like, next slide, musician, now painter, Wason Jones. Next slide. Nationally acclaimed printmaker Joyce Wellman. Next slide. The performance poetry collaborative group, Station to Station. Next slide. And yours truly. That's me right there in the glasses. The coffee house had a national representation, had a national rep, well, it was known nationally throughout, all in black circles, like all over the country. Folk had heard about the coffee house, and we hosted LGBTQ performers from around the country, including, next slide, the writing collective Other Countries from New York City, who sadly we lost a member of just 2 weeks ago. The brother there on the right side, holding the phone, Colin Robinson from Trinidad, who has reached the pantheon of great Caribbean poets and political organizers. On the far left there is Essex Hemphill, standing beside a Santo Saint with his arm around Craig Harris, all from New York, and all, as time went on, rose to great prominence as poets and organizers. Next slide. Also performing at the coffee house was the musical duo Castleberry and Dupree from the Bay Area. As DC's Black, lesbian, and gay artists garnered public exposure beyond the gay community, their collective and individual voices, next slide, bravely celebrated their identities amid the shadows of denial and repression. Going back to author Jenny Beam, she notes in her 2015 publication, Queer Capital, next slide, arguably, more than any other single institution in the country, the coffee house helped launch a national Black gay movement. Coffee house regulars either produced or were major contributors to many of the groundbreaking works on the experiences of Black lesbians, gay men, and bisexuals in the 1980s and early 1990s. Next slide. For some, this documentary will serve as an introduction to this vibrant community of artists and activists. For others, it will preserve the poignant art these Washingtonians created and offered an opportunity to relive these evenings of stimulating art. It will show the artistic and political history of this great city of Washington, D.C. Fierce and Served will hopefully bring to light one more aspect of Black gay history. Next slide. And hopefully through this film, we will connect all these facets together. DC history, gay history, Black history, and just show the rich contribution that we have added to what's going on nationally and in DC. Last slide, please. I want to take a moment just to recognize the sources that I use, particularly this first one, the historic context statement for Washington's LGBTQ resources. You can find that online, and it is, wow, I think it's over about 150 pages, 180 pages of documentation that tells just the whole story of gay DC with very, very detailed and accessible information. It'll be great reading for everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Kenny. That's it.
Awesome. Thank you. That was That was great. Thank you so much for that.
And thank you for being a technician there. I apologize everybody for that technical kind of hiccup there, but we got it together. I appreciate you being so nimble, my brother.
It's not a problem, not a problem. To see some of these comments, history. Yes, Chris, this is history, history. Daniel Antoine Probert, learn your hood roots. Yeah. History, flowers. Awesome. Thanks, James. Thank you. This is great. No, it was just funny listening to you talk and look at the slides. Shout out to Ernest Hopkins. I know Ernest, he's still out here doing the good fight, fighting for all of us, from coast to coast, right? Because this man is in the West Coast doing the work, and you won't be surprised to see him like pop up here in the East Coast doing the same thing. So shout out to him.
Ernest shout out to days ago, as a matter of fact.
Oh, really? Yeah. Ernest is
there at the core, and during the 80s, Ernest was working here in DC at that time, and he was in the coalition. And then he had that base of building out Pride. It was a big, just a strong, vibrant community that with activism and the artists, and we all just kind of came together to fill that space that we were so invisible in, and to empower each other.
Yeah, it was, and that's something I noted. Like I'm a note taker, so I was copying a bunch of notes. And that's exactly what I got. It was just like everyone just came together for one cause, right? It was about just like betterment of our people, getting our rights together. Seeing Dr. Simmons, God, rest in peace. Like he was, I worked for him for many years, and he made sure all of us that worked there read Tongues Untied. We knew Tongues Untied. We knew Essex Hemphill. He talked about it all the time. That was great. It's funny seeing Alan Locks because, the Capitol Ballroom Council honored him for Black History Month. It was just so many things that just kept on like popping out. Just like, oh my gosh, and I just never knew. The first Black Pride, Racine Pendarvis, who I talk to often, was the first MC on the stage at the first DC Black Pride.
And Racine is a master. She is like she is something else.
Yes.
1 year for Pride. This was not the first year, but this was maybe like later down the line, maybe 3 or 4. Because I think Racine was the MC for every Pride from the first one on through. On the stage. And 1 year, Earl Folks, I was a host at one point, and Earl put me on after Racine. I was through. I was like, Earl, I cannot go on the stage after Racine. How's that going to throw tomatoes at me?
Yeah, Racine. We had I also co-chair the Capitol Ballroom Council, and we did a session on ballroom history. And Racine came on, and what I tell you, Racine just like not only kept the energy up, but just the information and history and everything. And I was just like, Racine, you are a class act. Yes, a treasure. We got a message here. Thank you, Chris. We also showcase many dancers and singers as well at the
George Bellinger. See, that's a man that knows, because George Bellinger was on the scene as well. And George spent evenings in the coffee house along with all of us. So I know George knows what I talk about. But George, you can look up in there. He knows the story. He lived it.
Oh, wow. And, like I've always heard about the Children's Hour, but I didn't know about all the places that came before it, that led up to it. And I knew about the Children's Hour being the impetus to start, what is, like you said, the Black Pride movement, right? DC Black Pride. And actually, we're at 45 U.S. Prides now here in the United States. Wow. 45. I don't want to say it's over 50 internationally, because I know we got a couple in some parts in Africa and the Caribbean. We got Paris, the UK. It's a whole, it's Ernest started a whole movement. Ernest and his team started a whole movement.
He and Theodore, great guy, God rest his soul. Driven, intelligent, strong brothers. And this is a story when people think of homosexuals of African descent. These images and people, these tales do not come up. They always, in America, we have kind of fetishized Black anguish. And it's always about the struggle and getting beat upside the head and, which is no denying that part of our history. But there's also the triumph. There's also the coming together, the intellect, the perseverance that we have that has elevated our people. And when it comes to homosexuals of African descent, that story is not told hardly at all.
No. Again, shout out to Ron Simmons. That's one of the things he did. After he left Us Upping Us, he went on to start Bodeme, which talked about our presence in African culture and history and where we were. When you talk about Howard, I knew of Howard's group Cascade. That's when I think it moved to like Blagosa now, but I didn't know it was called Lambda Sun Alliance before that.
Yeah, that's what it was.
No idea.
When it first began, when those kids left that Black Third World Conference and wanted to start an organization at Howard, it met with some resistance. It took the support of the community outside of Howard to give them, to buttress the resistance they got and help that come to fruition.
See what we can do when we come together? When we come together, to see like that old pictures of DC Black Pride with 800 people, and now we're seeing 30,000-40,000 people coming to DC Black Pride every year. I think the last time it was about like 35 or 36,000 people came to DC Black Pride on an off year.
And that was an experience at that time, because it was like in the middle of the day, Banneker Field, which is like right across the street from Howard University, and it was right open to the public right there on this big old baseball field. And it was an act of bravery because I'll say for myself, I was nervous. I went to that first Pride and I was nervous. I thought we would be fenced in. We could have easily been attacked. We just know what was going to happen, what it was going to be like. But it was such a celebration. It was just a myriad of all the groups in the city, and folks came. It was just a ball, and we had to take it inside because as time went on, it kept getting rained out. Something was going on in the cosmos that every damn year for about 3 years in a row, it got rained out. So they had to move Pride on the inside. But it was just a powerful experience. Those first couple of Prides, it was amazing.
We have one of the folks that work with us at the Center for Black Equity, Janice Chambers Woods. I think she's traveling, that's why she couldn't join us today. She was at the first Pride as well, and she was 12. Wow. I think she was 12 or 11. Her grandma took her to the first Pride, and she was there and been going ever since. So, shout out to Janice. It was just so many things. I never knew about the Black Coalition of Black Gays and Women. I'm gonna definitely go look them up because that's quite interesting.
That was a really that again was like a groundbreaking thing. And DC, this history is not known, so we don't talk about it much, and so we don't own that power, I think. As we're in this period of transition right now, politically and culturally, it's good for us to own that power because it's what we're going to need to move forward. Because we as Black people are under pressure right now, and I don't think it's going to get better. White supremacy does not give up its space easily.
Not at all.
But the coalition was the first political organization in the country. Black gay folk came together. They met, smart, determined people, just to find a voice. It was just to bring that voice together and to let people know that you are not alone. That you in Philadelphia, you in San Francisco, you in Boston, you in DC, you this is us. And that Third World Conference, I didn't go to it. I remember when it happened, but I didn't go to that conference. But I remember the buzz. And when folks in the Caribbean started registering for that thing, folk were like, this is it. We knew we were on something. It was powerful.
Wow. If you're just tuning in, we just finished having a great presentation of Black Gay DC and facilitated by Christopher Prince, which was great. We're just talking about it now. If you missed it, rewind and watch it back from the beginning because there was so much information that you crammed into that thing. Like it was great, hearing you talk about, the coffee house and all the poetry and all the entertainment. It's interesting because a few years ago, we had we had a poet that did our poetry slam for a few years, Mary Bowman, and sadly she passed away. Maybe it might have been a week before Pride in 2019. I think it might have been 2019 or 2018. So right away, what we did was we called it the Mary Bowman Poetry Slam. So it's interesting that you talked about poetry being so important back at the beginning, and even to Pride right now. It's that event is sold out every year. One year we had the poetry slam, and this is when Mary Bowman took it over. We had a space in the hotel, and we had to keep on having them expand the room, so they couldn't expand it anymore because people. So poetry has been a consistent line through DC gay history. So that was great. George says, yeah, and so many of the early founders have passed. Lowell Hughes, still in Baltimore, and
really
Jones in Silver Spring. Wow. Yeah, see, George, you need to hop on here for the next time because you got some history up there that you're giving us too, some information. No, this was great. This was great. I got homework. I got a whole sheet of paper with all these markings on it. Like I was just writing down things and trying to move the slides at the same time and trying to write them out. No, this was great. Thank you.
It was my pleasure to share this information, and I appreciate you guys asking me. I'm honored.
No problem. Thank you so much. Well, I won't keep you for the rest of the day. We again, clearly I'm blown away. This was great. So again, thank you for that, and everyone watching. Like I said, if you missed it, it's going to be living on live. It's going to be on a YouTube channel. Right now, it's streaming on my Facebook page, the Center for Black Equity Facebook page, DC Black Pride's Facebook page, the Legends on the House's Facebook page, Capital Ballroom Council's Facebook page, Capital Ballroom Council's YouTube channel. These are all the places you can find this presentation. So if you missed it, it'll be there for you all to go back and watch again. Go ahead.
Can I just say one thing before we go? I want to point you all, speaking of sites and locations online. We are coming to the end of the crowdfunding campaign for the documentary Fierceness Served, the Enoch Alley Coffee House. So you guys can go online to www.thecoffeehousedc.com. We still got a couple of hours left in our crowdfunding campaign. We are raising money to support our spring schedule of filming. The film will be done in July 2021. It's going to show all over in DC libraries. We're going to go to these political organizations. And Kenya, we'd like to come and bring the film to you guys and have a presentation with you all and have a discussion.
Absolutely.
When it's completed.
Absolutely.
30-minute presentation. And you can go to my personal website. As Racine would say, shameless. What does she say?
Shameless plug. The queen of the shameless plug.
Which is ChrisPrinceCreates.com to learn a little more about me. And if you guys love jazz, Friday, 8 o'clock, AtlasArts.com. It's free, 30 minutes of jazz. I got a hot trio. We're doing music, some spoken word poetry as well. So come on and enjoy some of that.
So that was The Coffee House DC?
THE,
The
CoffeeHouseDC.com.
I'm gonna pop it up on the screen for everyone. So those 3 websites.
Oh, right. So you're quick.
Check it out, everybody. Again, thank you so much. It was a wealth of information. History, right? History. Denise said you're looking fabulous and so young.
Hey, man, it's not easy. It doesn't snap back like it used to, all right?
The Taj Hill, Leave Clegg, the Taj Hill. Excellent presentation. Yes, it was. Oh, awesome.
She is anthropologist and scholar in her own rights.
Oh, I know that's right. I love it.
She's smarter than me.
Love it. Oh my gosh. It's usually the sisters that are smart. My sister's smarter than me. I say it all the time.
I don't know why, baby. Them G's come back. They said no. The first try. This is all right. We can do better on the second one.
You can do better the next one, right? That's what happened.
Don't have worked out like that.
Oh my gosh. All right. Thank you again. Thank you for watching, everyone online. Again, keep on the lookout for more 12 months of DC Black Pride, as we be rolling things out, leading up to DC Black Pride Month. All right. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.